Chapter 1. The Perfect Alibi. The evening unfolded like a well-written sentence, smooth, deliberate, and beautifully paced. The air was scented with lavender and aged oak, carrying the faintest note of rain from the garden beyond the French doors. Golden light spilled across the polished floorboards, catching the shimmer of crystal glasses and the warm laughter that lingered between them. Every guest seemed to glow, every voice blending softly with the piano's tender rhythm in the background dot. At the head of the long, mahogany table sat Arthur Bellamy, a novelist whose words had graced bestsellers and whose smile could charm even his fiercest critics. He raised his glass and looked around at the familiar faces, fellow writers, editors, old friends, each one a thread in the tapestry of his perfectly curated evening. His voice, calm and deliberate, carried the room. To old stories and new beginnings, he said. The toast was simple, elegant, unhurried, and the room echoed with a gentle chime of crystal. Outside, the garden lamps swayed softly in the breeze, and the faint hum of the city was distant, harmless, like a memory. The dinner conversation meandered from books to travel, to the curious little things that make life delightful. A guest recited a poem. Another laughed softly at a passing joke. The warmth of the wine, the flicker of candlelight, and the steady rhythm of calm conversation made time itself seem to stretch. A peaceful lull before the unseen storm. Arthur leaned back, watching the laughter ripple down the table like a slow-moving wave. He was content. He had prepared every detail, the seating plan, the menu, the music, even the timing of the evening's subtle surprises. To anyone else it was simply a dinner party, refined, relaxing, and utterly ordinary. But for Arthur it was something more. Every perfect evening needs structure, after all, and his structure was flawless, right down to the minute. The grandfather clock in the corner struck 9. Its tone was soft, low, and reassuring. Guests smiled at the sound, unconsciously comforted by its rhythm. Arthur smiled, too, a private smile, the kind a writer wears when the ending is already written, even though the audience doesn't yet know it. He excused himself briefly, walking through the quiet corridor to his study. The walls there were lined with books, hundreds of them, stories of love, loss, triumph, and tragedy. The familiar scent of ink and paper surrounded him, grounding him in calm certainty. He stood by the window for a moment, looking out at the reflection of the candle-lit garden. The moon had risen, casting a silvery comb across the night. Behind him, the murmur of voices carried softly through the door. No one would question his absence. No one would wonder where he had gone for those few quiet minutes, because Arthur Bellamy, master storyteller and charming host, had written the perfect alibi, and for now it was beautiful. Chapter 2. A Toast to the Victim. As laughter echoes through the mansion, one glass is poured with more than just wine. A silent death awaits. The laughter rose like warm steam from a kettle, soft and harmless, and drifted beneath the painted ceiling where cherubs forever held garlands of flowers. In the dining room's mellow hush, candle flames leaned toward one another, as if confiding. Beyond the tall windows, the garden lamps kept their faithful watch. Nothing hurried, nothing pressed. The evening, like a courteous host, asked for no more than to be enjoyed. Arthur Bellamy's dinner party had found its rhythm, the unhurried sway that comes when strangers have become companions for a night. A pianist in the corner coaxed a gentle waltz from the keys. Conversation lifted and settled, until even the silver knew to ring more softly against the plates. The servants moved with the smooth quiet of a well-practiced script, whispering only when necessary, never intruding on a sentence's final word. At the center of it all sat Lila Harrow, the guest of honor in everything but name. Her laughter did not rise often, but when it did, it turned heads without trying. There was nothing theatrical about her. She simply wore ease like a shawl. An editor with a talent for polishing the hearts of other people's stories, Lila had come to the party to celebrate the launch of a new imprint of favor to Arthur, who credited her with saving his last novel from a slow and dignified death by excess. She had smiled at that, then shrugged, as if to say there was no heroism in removing 3 adjectives from a single sentence. Still, she accepted his gratitude and his invitation, and the place at his right hand. On Arthur's left sat Julian Parr, a critic with a velvet voice and a reputation sharper than it sounded. He had made his name writing judgments that were never cruel, only decisive. Tonight he was luminous with good manners, his compliments perfectly folded, his insights perfectly timed. Beside him, hands clasped around her wine-glass, as though it were a delicate bird, was Maeve Delaney, a poet who made nostalgia feel like a fresh breeze. Across the table, blessed by candlelight and cautious charm, was Thomas Reed, an agent whose laughter could sell a book all by itself. The menu had passed from the tender salt of chilled oysters to the forgiving warmth of roasted duck. Faces glowed as if the light were coming from within them. The chandelier listened. The grandfather clock, kind as a reliable friend, marked the hour with a tone you could lean on. Even the wine wore civility. It did not insist. It offered. "Another splash?" asked René the sommelier, tone so gentle it almost nodded on its own. He was a slight man with careful hands and a habit of tilting his head as he listened, as if to catch the exact shade of a guest's reply. "Just a whisper," Lila said, easing her glass forward. "It's too lovely to rush." René smiled, then hovered the bottle of Kate and Nuits above the rim, letting the bouquet rise first like a promise. The first drop landed with a small ruby sigh. He gave her the whisper she requested, and no more. The label faced outward, a professional's courtesy, and the neck of the bottle breathed a neat, cool thread of air. At the far end, Arthur tapped his spoon against his glass lightly, politely. A hush fell that was not truly a hush, only the room lowering its voice to accommodate something pleasant. Arthur's smile was unshowy, his eyes tired in the way that comes of long satisfaction. "My friends," he said, "if I grow sentimental, blame the music." "Blame the wine," Julian murmured, and the table smiled. Arthur's gaze drifted over them with fondness that did not over-explain itself. "We are gathered," he continued, "not to crown anything, not to close anything, but to salute an honest labor. Lila," he turned with a modest flourish, "you have been the quiet compass for so many of us. You find the true north in a paragraph without ever making a scene about it. I would like to raise a glass to clear eyes and gentle hands." It was the sort of toast that lands with the softness of a good blanket. Forks paused mid-air. Eyes lifted. Glass stems were touched, then lightly touched again, as if the first contact had been too brisk. Lila's cheeks warmed. She began to protest only a little, Because protest itself can be a kind of indulgence, then let her smile be the reply. To Lila, Maeve said. To Lila, echoed Thomas. To Lila, Julian agreed, leaning the syllables against one another as though stacking them for display. Renee moved like the closing line of a perfect paragraph, unobtrusive, inevitable. He completed the circle of the table, a final check. Tiny nods traded with those who desired another measure, polite declines for those who preferred tea. When he reached Arthur, he paused. A second bottle waited in his silver cradle. This one wore no familiar label-only discreet cream paper, its script private and old-fashioned. Arthur glanced at it with the sort of small relish that signals a secret kept not to exclude, but to delight when revealed. Something special? Julian asked. Even his curiosity had upholstery. A sentimental bottle, Arthur said, almost apologetically. A friend gave it to me years ago with instructions to open it on a pleasant night. I took the liberty of deciding this one qualifies. How easy it is, in a safe room, to let your guard be charmed by sentiment. Renee removed the wax with a neat, unhurried turn of the wrist. The cork emerged like a sigh, remembered. In the faint hush that accompanies a small ceremony, you could hear the pianist smile. "Allow me," Arthur said, accepting the bottle as someone might accept a letter. He poured the first measure for Lila, a host's courtesy. The wine did not glug. It flowed. The color was darker than expected, like velvet after dusk. Lila lifted the glass, not to drink, but to admire, placing it close to the candle so the flame could have its say. "It looks like late summer," she said. "The moment the light starts to change." A gentle murmur approved. Compliments in this room were not darts, but cushions. Across from her, Thomas lifted his glass and sniffed. Black cherry, cedar, the faintest memory of smoke. Julian sniffed too, offering nothing. His specialty was restraint worn as elegance. Only one person in that circle knew that the bottle had traveled a separate path before it arrived at the table. The journey had been careful, unremarkable, and utterly devoid of haste. The added element, odorless, colorless, indifferent to poetry, had slipped through the funnel like any other secret. The world forgives because it does not raise its voice. It was not a villain with a cape. It was the low hum behind a refrigerator door, present, patient, ordinary. "Before we drink," Arthur said, "I should like to say a second thing." He waited, a conductor allowing a bar of silence for the orchestra to sit up straight. "We make stories with more than words. We make them with manners, with the way we wait for one another, with the way we decline to be clever when kindness will do. I have learned more about that craft from Miss Harrell than from any book." He tipped his glass toward Lila, who lowered her eyes because graciousness needs a place to stand. "To kindness," Maeve said, softly. "To kindness," they echoed, and the crystal chimed dot. It is a curious truth that people rarely taste the first sip. They taste the mood instead, and the mood tonight was silk. Lila wet her lips, then allowed the wine to settle on her tongue. She closed her eyes and breathed once slowly, like someone letting a favorite song find its way back. She did not rush a second sip. She set the glass down gently, the base finding its exact circle on the linen. "Lovely," she said. "Well worth waiting for." Renee, professional and nearly invisible, permitted himself the smallest inward nod. The servants retreated with quiet plates. The pianist turned a page. Conversation resumed in that tender register between thought and voice that no one hurried. At that table the future did not exist yet. There was only present tense, and it was mild. Julian told a story about a playwright who refused to cut a single line. The punchline was not cruel, and so it landed kindly. Maeve recited 2 lines of a poem by a friend who needed a little luck. Thomas spoke of a client who had set his heart on a book tour by train, and how the very idea of slow compartments and station tea had made the interviews better. Lila listened. She did that better than most. She asked questions that did not feel like exams. She noticed a small chip in the rim of her plate and decided not to mention it. She thought about calling her mother the next day. The voice that always steadied when morning coffee was still warm. She considered for half a moment the kindness of staying late to help Arthur see off the last of the guests. Another sip. A lightness in the chest, but then wine has permission to be generous. A flutter at the edge of her vision. Perhaps the candle had learned a new dance. She rested her fingers on the base of the glass, cool and perfectly round. She smiled toward Arthur, because gratitude should not miss its cue. "Are you quite well?" Arthur asked, noticing the way she steadied her glass with both hands. His tone was light, no alarm in it, only the gentle concern of a host who likes his guests to be happy. "I'm fine," Lila said, and she was so far as she understood the word in that moment. The room breathed as rooms do. The chandelier softened, as chandeliers sometimes will when seen through the varnish of a pleasant evening. She blinked, then allowed a small, self-deprecating smile. "I think the week is catching up with me." "Then you shall rest, and the week can chase someone else," Maeve said. The table laughed a little, not at Lila, but near her, which is the friendlier version. Arthur lifted a hand, and the pianist slipped into something slower, a lullaby wearing ballroom shoes. In the corner, the clock's second hand continued its small, obedient pilgrimage. A servant set down a fresh carafe of water. Layla took a sip, and the glass left a clean crescent on the linen. Like a moon rehearsing dot, it is in such gentle rooms that endings come dressed as pauses. Lila's smile remained. It only dimmed a fraction, as if someone had lowered the light to see whether the candle would notice. A coolness moved along her neck, the kind that sometimes announces a fever hours before it arrives. She was not frightened. She was almost content. The body knows how to lie kindly to the mind when panic would be impolite. "Shall we step to the salon for coffee?" Arthur suggested, feeling the evening shift the way a ship shifts under a change in tide. No danger, only a new rhythm. "Coffee sounds perfect," Thomas said. "Decaf for me," Maeve added. "Or you'll find me reciting an epic at 2 in the morning." Julian smiled without teeth. The nation would be fortunate. Chairs made soft decisions with the carpet. Napkins folded themselves after the manner of well-trained linen. The door to the salon sighed open and released the scent of orange peel and chocolate, the promise of small cups and smaller spoons. Leela rose last, not because she was unsteady, but because she took care with gatherings to allow each guest his moment of leaving without a crowd. She placed her fingertips lightly on the back of her chair, a small courtesy to gravity, and felt again that coolness, a mild ringing, as though a distant bicycle bell had taken a wrong turn into her ears. "Perhaps a moment," she said to no one in particular, and to the room in general. I'll join you." Arthur hesitated. He considered asking if she would like an arm. He considered asking Rena for a chair nearer the door. He considered and chose the lightest touch. "We'll be just there," he said. "Take your time. It's a friendly night." She thanked him with a look and turned toward the sideboard, where the flowers waited in a tangle of white and green. They smelled like memory after rain. She breathed them in. A moth, attracted by the chandelier's soft sermon, circled once, thought better of it, and disappeared toward the pantry door. The sound Lila made was not a sound anyone would call distress. It was the sort of small exhale you give a friend when the joke is better than you expected. She steadied herself with one hand on the mahogany, and the varnish held her reflection like a companion prepared to keep a confidence. Her glass still shone a faint ring of red at the bottom, like a sunset that refused to leave the horizon. Arthur approached, not too close, no fuss. "I know that look," he said, comfortably. "It's the one that says the day was longer than the evening deserved." "I'm being spoiled," Lila said, and laughed quietly. "It's been a while." "Then allow the indulgence," he replied. "The coffee is worth the walk, I promise." She nodded, and for a heartbeat the room tilted barely, like a picture frame discovered to be minutely askew. She corrected it by standing still, a technique she had learned long ago in crowded bookshops. Do not demand balance. Invite it. It came, as it often did, politely dot in the hallway. The guests admired a painting, because admiration is a good way to wait for someone without making it look like waiting. Renee slipped through with a tray of cups white porcelain, silver rims, their saucers whispering hello to the air. The kitchen exhaled a tide of warmth that waddled happily into the colder hall. "Shall I bring coffee here, Miss Harrell?" Renee asked, quietly, having returned for the forgotten corkscrew, and discovering that some people prefer the harbor to the journey. "Would you?" she said, and the gratitude in her voice made the favor a gift. Arthur stayed, not hovering, simply not leaving. He glanced at the decanter, the sentimental bottle, its neck glistening with an innocent thread. He thought of his toast, of kindness, of the variety that does not announce itself. He thought, briefly and without drama, of the way Lila's hand had found the sideboard. "Perhaps the air," he suggested. "It's gentle tonight." "That would be nice," she said. He opened the French door a fraction, and the garden entered on tiptoe. The night was cool enough to forgive a warm room, soft enough to forgive the day. Crickets stitched a quiet seam along the edge of the lawn. Somewhere beyond the trees a car passed, not in a hurry. Lila stepped once into the threshold, not to leave, only to borrow a piece of the garden's calm. The breeze touched her hair and left it where it found it. She smiled toward something the rest of them could not see, the restful idea that all stories, even the difficult ones, begin with a room where someone is kind. She took the cup Renee offered. The porcelain felt honest in her hands. She sipped. The chocolate note shook hands with the orange and agreed to be friends. The world settled. Arthur let the door stand open an inch and considered the way night could make a house look like a promise. Then came the third sensation, not the coolness, not the tilt, but a softness behind her knees, a gentle persuasion rather than a demand. She did not fight it. She placed the cup down with perfect care, as though to spare the saucer any surprise, and breathed again. Her hand returned to the sideboard. The rosebuds in the vase regarded her with the tolerant sweetness of flowers that expect little and offer a lot. "Shall I?" Arthur began, with the smallest motion toward support. "It's nothing," Lila said, because that phrase was easier to carry than any other. Her voice was agreeable, her eyes steady enough to convince. "Just a little light-headed." "Then we will be slow," Arthur said. The pianist, now distant, played a melody that had learned long ago not to disturb conversations. Across the hall, Julian was telling Thomas that there was a difference between clever and wise, and that one grows tired far sooner than the other. Maeve, coiling her scarf with absent precision, nodded at a sentence she planned to borrow and never confess. None of them hurried. The house, proud of its ability to hold an evening without dropping it, continued to hold. Lila turned her head to say something, perhaps thank you, perhaps a joke about the perils of excellent wine, and discovered that the word had chosen a softer chair and would arrive when it liked. She did not mind. Some words behave that way around midnight. The grandfather clock in the dining room offered its counsel. 1, 2, 3 measured, low, not as verdict, but as reassurance that time had not forgotten anyone. Layla listened, grateful for its manners. When she swayed, it was a small movement, enough to make Arthur's hand lift a polite inch. She steadied herself, and the moment passed, as moments do when treated kindly. She smiled truer than before, oddly, and let the breath go. "Better?" Arthur asked. "Better," she said, and it was nearly true dot in the salon. Coffee cups murmured against saucers. Someone laughed gently. The moth, having reconsidered everything twice, found its way back to the window and chose the night instead of the chandelier. Renee, having collected a tray of Petty's fours that glowed like patient jewels, paused at the threshold to interpret the scene. Professionals learn the difference between silence that needs an interruption and silence that deserves company. He decided to be company. "Almond or orange, Miss Harrell?" he asked, as if the entire question of the evening could be solved with something sweet. "Orange," Lila said, with the decisive kindness of a guest who knows the right. "Answer is the one that lets someone else be useful." She held the morsel on her palm for a moment, because it looked cheerful there. When she tasted it, the sugar dust kissed the roof of her mouth, and she thought of a bakery long ago where someone had once saved the last tart for her, because she always smiled at the owner's dog. It was a harmless memory. It was an excellent one to have just then. The softness behind the knees returned, not scolding, simply reminding. Lila's palm found the sideboard again. A brief conversation with the varnish. Arthur stepped in without fuss and offered her his arm. She accepted without drama. Together, unhurried, they crossed the distance of 5 calm steps to a chair that had been, as if by secret instruction, placed near the open door. "There we are," Arthur said, as if awarding a small prize. "The very best seat in the theater." "Only if the actors are quiet," Lila replied, and the breeze applauded. She closed her eyes not in surrender, but in gratitude for the kind of dark that listens. The house obliged. The guests, sensing a pause worth protecting, allowed the conversation to bend away from noise. Even Julian's discernment put down its tools. The evening, generous to the last, made room for a gentler tempo. Somewhere, in the clockwork of inevitabilities, the silent death went about its business as softly as dust. It had no quarrel with Lila's grace, no special antipathy for her kindness. It performed its task with the modesty of a backstage hand moving scenery between acts. And because this was a house that valued decorum, it did so without spectacle. Lila rested. Her breathing was even, a page turning in a quiet book. The orange note from the coffee lingered. The wine's velvet had receded to a memory that felt like a smooth stone in the pocket. She opened her eyes once more and found Arthur watching her with concern. He tried not to polish into panic. "Shall I fetch a doctor?" he asked, as gently as a question can be asked. "Let's not trouble anyone," she said. "It will pass. The air is very kind." And for a while it seemed she was right. The breeze threaded her hair. The garden kept its compact with the moon. Behind them the salon made small talk with its usual tact. If the evening had been a ship, it would have been gliding. She closed her eyes again, not to miss anything, but to keep everything she liked in place, the kindness in Arthur's voice, the old clock's steady counsel, Maeve's scarf behaving like a tame wave, Reen's tray reflecting the chandelier in tidy circles, Thomas laughing as if optimism were a full-time job. Julian's attention narrowed to a point that could prick a balloon or mend one. These were good things. Let them be, she thought. Let them be. When the moment arrived, the true one, it did not announce itself. It simply asked the room to lower its voice a second more. Lila's hand slid from the arm of the chair as delicately as a bookmark slipping from a page. Her head tipped not dramatically, but with the same courtesy she had given every conversation that night. Arthur said her name, because names are the first thread we reach for when fabric loosens. "Lila?" Her breath answered once, a small and peaceful tide. The second answer did not come. Silence, trained by years of good manners, held its breath too. Arthur stood, then knelt, a movement smooth enough to startle no one. Renee set the tray aside with a composure that would have won applause in any other theater. Maeve, realizing before she allowed herself to accept it, pressed a hand to her mouth as if to make the world softer. Thomas looked for the practical thing, the telephone, the number, the sequence that would bring help like daylight. Julian, for once, said nothing and looked like a man who had been wrong about the difference between clever and wise. The house did not panic. It refused. The chandelier's light was steady. The night, considerate as always, drew its shawl a little closer around the garden. The clock shocked into a brief pause, remembered its duty, and began again. A moment later, somewhere between urgency and reverence, the room shifted from company to care. Voices stayed low, not because anyone asked them to, but because good people almost always know how to speak in the presence of something important. The glass Lila had lifted still rested on the sideboard, a lipstick crescent on its rim, the wine within it docile and mute. On the linen, the ring her water had left had dried into a faint silver. The moth made one last visit to the window, and then departed. Certain now of the night's instructions, when the phone calls ended and footsteps found their new tasks, Arthur remained by the chair, his face a study in courtesy under strain. He did not demand explanations from the air. He did not curse sentiment or wine or clocks or the respectable work of evening. He simply looked at the woman who had taught him earlier that night a better way to make a toast. He adjusted the edge of her sleeve so that it sat correctly. because respect is a habit, and habits reveal who we are when decisions become difficult. In the hall, a small sound announced the approach of someone whose shoes were more practical than decorative. A door whispered. A coat anyone's was placed over Lila's knees, as one places a note between pages to mark the exact place where the story changed. The pianist, hands folded in his lap now, stared at the keys and thought of the silence after the last note. He wondered if endings always knew they were endings. He decided they did not. They did what they were asked to do and let the living draw the borders. Outside, the hedges kept faith with their shape. Inside, the wine decanted into quiet. The sentimental bottle sat innocent in its cradle, like a message that had reached the wrong address and waited patiently to be forwarded. If the evening had a face, it would have been kind even then. If it had a voice, it would have said, "Hold one another's coats. Dim the lights a little, speak softly, and see the guest to the edge of the garden, as though the world were a place designed for gentleness." And if a single thought hovered unspoken above the low, careful voices, it was this: somewhere, not yet summoned, but walking the long hallway of the city with his rumpled coat and his questions that feel like apologies, a lieutenant would arrive and find the quiet we are leaving behind. He would notice the lipstick crescent, the sentimental label, the orange on the air. He would lower his voice, too, because this house had taught everyone how. But for now, before the doorbell, before the pads of pencils, before the soft cough that precedes just one more thing, the mansion exhaled, and the knight, holding the story in both hands, turned the page. Chapter 3, Midnight in the Study. The house had fallen into the sort of silence that only follows long conversation, a silence full of polite ghosts. The dinner dishes had been cleared, the piano closed, the laughter folded neatly away like linen. Lamps burned low in the hallway, casting slow amber puddles across the floor. Outside, the rain had returned with a measured touch, brushing the windows as though to remind the walls they still belonged to the night. Arthur Bellamy's study waited behind a door of polished walnut. It was a room that smelled of tobacco, old paper, and the faint sweetness of lemon oil, rubbed into the desk each morning by hands that respected wood. Books leaned toward one another on the shelves, the spines wearing gold that caught the firelight. A globe stood half-turned toward the Pacific, as if lost in thought. The only movement came from the fire itself, breathing softly through the grate. It was nearly midnight when Arthur entered. He closed the door with the care of a man folding a letter he meant to keep private. His jacket hung open, his tie loose, his smile, should anyone have seen it, faint and weary. The party had gone as well as he'd hoped, and yet there was a tremor beneath the satisfaction, a quiet disquiet that refused to settle. He crossed to the desk, found a cigar waiting beside the ashtray, and rolled it between his fingers. The sound of the match flaring was a small, civilized explosion. The smoke rose in delicate, persuasive rings. For a time, Arthur watched them drift, one within another, dissolving before they reached the lamp. A poet might have called it peace. Down the corridor, the grandfather clock began its long, patient climb toward 12. Its chime carried just enough authority to reach the study door. Arthur listened, counting the strokes, feeling the rhythm soothe him the way ritual always does. When the last note faded, he turned back to his desk, opened a drawer, and removed a stack of typed pages secured with a brass clip. The manuscript was his next novel, unfinished but close. He ran his hand over the top sheet as though greeting an old friend. The title stared back at him in his own firm type, The Perfect Alibi. The irony was not lost on him. From the mantelpiece, the portrait of his late wife looked down with permanent composure. "You would have enjoyed tonight," he said softly, not expecting an answer. Layla was radiant. The others behaved themselves. For once, everything went according to plan. He set the pages aside and reached for the decanter. The brandy was dark as varnish. It made a slow amber spiral as he poured. Outside, a branch tapped against the glass, rhythmic and tender. He sipped, exhaled, and let the warmth travel through him. Somewhere beyond the door, a floorboard sighed, perhaps the house settling, perhaps a footstep. Arthur turned his head, half smiling. "Renee?" he called. No reply. He listened again. Nothing, only the fire murmuring to itself. He rose, crossed to the window, and drew back the curtain. The garden lay beneath a gauze of mist, the fountain frozen mid-gesture, the hedges obediently trimmed. All perfectly still. He closed the curtain and, without quite knowing why, locked it. Old habits, he thought. Safety and ceremony. He returned to the desk, opened another drawer, and removed a small velvet case. Inside rested a pistol, beautiful, compact, absurdly out of place in a writer's sanctuary. It was more ornament than weapon, a gift from a collector friend years ago. He checked the chamber as automatically as one checks a clock, then replaced it, leaving the case open beside the brandy. The door creaked once, barely audible. Arthur looked up. "Come in," he said, still calm. The handle turned, slow and deliberate, as though weighed down by thought rather than fear. The door opened a fraction, admitting a line of cooler air and the faintest shimmer of hallway light. "Back for a forgotten coat?" Arthur asked, a note of humor softening his words. The silence that followed was perfectly polite, too polite. He couldn't see the face, only the outline of someone standing just beyond the threshold. "It's late," he continued. "Let's not spoil the evening with secrets." The voice that answered was low, steady, almost affectionate. "No secrets left, Arthur." The gunshot came a heartbeat later, sharp, singular, echoing through the wooden ribs of the house like a bell struck too hard. The flame in the fireplace leapt and fell. The glass in the decanter trembled. Then silence again, thick and flawless dot in the dining room. A clock hiccuped on the next minute. In the guest rooms above, someone stirred and muttered a dreamer's question. Laughter would have been impossible now, even if anyone dared attempt it. Julian Parr was the first to open his door. He listened, his critic's mind parsing the sound, rejecting accident. A gun, downstairs, the study. He reached for his robe, tied it with unnecessary precision, and stepped into the corridor. Maeve's door opened next. Her face, pale in the half-light, held the question he refused to ask aloud. They moved together, quietly as people do when they hope noise might offend the truth. Thomas followed, his footsteps slower, heavier. In the drawing-room, the pianist, who had been sleeping on the couch by arrangement, sat upright. Blinking into the dark dot when they reached the study, the door was ajar. A curl of smoke, too gray for cigar smoke, hung in the air. The scent of brandy mingled with something metallic, unmistakable. Julian pushed the door wider with 2 fingers. As if entering a museum after hours, Arthur Bellamy lay behind the desk, his chair half turned toward the fireplace, his head resting against the armrest as if he had chosen that position for comfort. The pistol lay on the rug, indifferent. The fire continued to breathe, its light brushing his face with a kindness he no longer needed. Maeve covered her mouth. Thomas stepped back, finding the edge of a chair and sitting without memory of doing so. The pianist crossed himself. Julian, who preferred facts to feelings, leaned closer, not out of morbidity, but duty to certainty. "Dead," he said quietly. "Clean shot, chest." His tone was even, the tone of a man ordering tea. Then softer. "Good God, Arthur." Behind them, footsteps, René, white-faced, holding a candle that trembled in its brass ring. "Monsieur Bellamy?" he whispered, as though the host might only be dozing. The flame bent under his breath. No one spoke for a long time. The fire popped once, gentle as a sigh. Finally Thomas found words. "We should call the police." Julian nodded. "Of course." "Used a hall telephone." Maeve turned toward the corridor, but René stopped her with a motion of his hand. "Allow me, madame." "You should sit." He left, the candle's light retreating like a secret being withdrawn. The others remained, unwilling to abandon the host. The calm in the room began to press on them, an almost tender weight. Outside, the rain strengthened, polite applause against the glass. "Do you think it was—" Maeve couldn't finish the question. "Suicide?" Julian supplied. "No, the angle's wrong." He was seated. Someone stood there. He pointed toward the door, his voice low, analytical. Close range. Familiar distance. Thomas rubbed his temples. Everyone was in bed. Everyone. "Everyone will swear to that," Julian said, almost kindly. "That's what people do when the world changes too suddenly." René returned, setting the candle on the desk beside the manuscript. "The police are coming," he said. "They asked that we remain here." His voice quavered once, then steadied. Maeve's eyes drifted to the pages beside Arthur's hand. "The Perfect Alibi." The title looked newly cruel. "What an odd name for his last story," she murmured. Julian exhaled. "Or fitting." They waited. The fire shrank to embers. The house held its breath. The wind outside shifted, brushing the eaves like fingertips on piano keys. In the long pause before the authorities arrived, time itself seemed to sit with them, patient and solemn. When the knock finally came, a heavy, unhurried rap that belonged to duty, it felt like the closing of a chapter rather than the beginning of one. René opened the door. A man in a rain-damp coat stepped inside, removing his hat, shaking off a drizzle of honesty. His hair was untidy, his eyes politely curious. "Evening," he said, in a voice that managed to be both weary and kind. "Lieutenant Columbo, Los Angeles Police. I'm terribly sorry to intrude, folks, but I understand there's been some trouble." No one answered. The lieutenant looked around the room, at the fire, the decanter, the open case on the desk. He sniffed once, thoughtfully. "You know," he said, almost to himself, "it's a beautiful house. Peaceful, even now." He glanced at Arthur Bellamy's still form, then back to the assembled faces. "If it's all right," he murmured, pulling out a small notebook, "I'll just ask a couple of questions. Won't take long." Outside, the rain soughed again, as if the night itself were leaning closer to listen. The illusion of civility was gone, but the calm remained. a strange, measured calm, the kind that comes not from peace, but from the quiet certainty that every secret, sooner or later, finds its voice. Chapter 4. Enter Lieutenant Columbo. The front door creaked open just as dawn began to pale the windows, and in shuffled Lieutenant Columbo, coat rumpled, hair uncertain, expression apologetic. He mumbled something about the parking situation, about how his cigar had vanished somewhere between the station and the driveway. The guests watched, uneasy, as this gentle storm of disorder filled the polished room. Yet there was something soothing in his presence, a kindness behind the confusion, a warmth beneath the wrinkles. When he smiled and said, "Sorry to bother you folks," the tension in the air seemed to take a slow, tired breath and rest. Chapter 5. Just one more thing. Columbo's casual questions began to peel away the veneer of innocence, making one guest visibly uneasy. The morning settled over the house like a soft shawl, warm where it needed to be and loose where it didn't. Rain had rinsed the world into gentler colors. The garden glistened in quiet stripes of green and silver. Inside, the staff moved carefully, their footsteps padded by consideration. Coffee breathed from the sideboard in comforting curls. The clink of cup against saucer wore its manners proudly. Lieutenant Columbo stood near the window as if he'd drifted there by accident. His coat looked like it had known 1,000 weathers and never once complained. He ran a thumb along the glass, studying the way the droplets made slow decisions. "You've got a lovely view," he murmured, not to anyone in particular. "Helps a man think." The guests had gathered with the cooperative uncertainty of people who are trying to do the right thing without quite knowing what it is. Maeve sat poised but not stiff, hands wrapped around a cup as if it were a friendly bird. Thomas stood near the mantel with the quiet of a man who understands the value of being steady. Renee kept to the periphery, the respectful orbit of a professional, and Julian Parr, folded into a chair with deliberate ease, kept his expression smooth, his eyes mild, his attention sharpened to a private point. Columbo smiled his small, apologetic smile. "I'm grateful for your patience, folks. These things, well, you know how they are. They go faster when we don't rush him." He patted his pockets, discovered a pencil behind his ear, and made a satisfied sound. "There you are." He started with the sort of questions no one minds. Names, times, the flavor of the evening. He asked how the music sounded, whether the roast duck was as good as the scent suggested. If the coffee had a hint of orange peel, I could swear I smelled orange, and whether the rain had started before or after dessert. The questions came like friendly raindrops. They touched and cooled and went on their way. "You were all in your rooms when you heard the shot," he said gently, confirming what he already knew. "Doors closed? Lights off?" Nods. "Anybody have the kind of clock that ticks loud enough to keep you awake? It's just—" he rubbed the back of his neck. "I like to know what rooms sound like." Maeve smiled. The rain drowned everything. It sounded like the house was listening to a lullaby. "That's very pretty," Columbo said, genuinely pleased. "A lullaby. My wife, she says rain's the city's way of telling us to go easy." He turned to Thomas. "And you, sir?" "I sleep light," Thomas replied. "I heard the shot. I knew it was a shot. I came down at once." "Brave," Columbo said, admiring without fuss. A shot can make a man wait. He jotted a note. You reached the study. How long after, would you say? Seconds, Thomas said. Half a minute at most. My chum. Columbo's pencil rested. And Mr. Parr? Julian's smile was profession smooth. I heard the same sound as everyone else. I dressed and came down. You dressed? Columbo's eyebrows rose, friendly surprise only. You mean tie robe, that kind of thing? A robe, Julian said evenly. One doesn't rush into corridors in pajamas. Columbo nodded as if the remark had taken him somewhere interesting. Of course. My wife tells me the same thing about taking out the trash. A mild chuckle. Now, forgive me, sir, just one more thing. When you got to the study, who was already there? Maeve, Julian said, without hesitation. And Thomas. Renee arrived a moment later. Columbo turned to Maeve, who offered the same order with the calm of a person who prefers consensus to correction. Renee, swallowing, affirmed it as well. The lieutenant made a tidy bracket on the page. About that door, Columbo went on, drifting toward the study as if following a set. It was open when you found Mr. Bellamy, Ajar, you said. He placed his palm against the varnished wood, felt the slow cool there. Funny thing about doors. They remember the last person who touched them. Not in a court of law, way more in a housekeeper's way. A smudge, a squeak, a not quite right latch. He depressed the latch and released it. The door answered with a polite cluck. You hear that? That's a happy latch. Heard a lot of unhappy ones in my time. He peered at the strike plate, then almost absent-mindedly at the lower hinge, where a soft crescent of new polish shone against older sheen. Someone cares for their woodwork. Arthur did, Maeve said, her voice dipping at the name. He loved order. Columbo nodded. Order's a fine thing. It helps a person breathe. He stepped into the study. The room had been tidied only by necessity, the sheet drawn, the pistol tagged, the decanter capped. The lieutenant didn't touch. He looked, which is a kind of touch you can't dust. He noticed the open velvet case, the manuscript patiently waiting, the brandy's amber eye watching from the desk. He noticed, too, a second glass on the side table water, unfinished beads of condensation spreading like a pale halo. Back in the doorway, he half turned, sheepish. This is going to sound like nothing, folks, but did anyone move that glass? No, said Renee. We were instructed not to touch anything. Well, that's fine. That's just fine. He leaned closer, humming thoughtfully. You ever notice how a person who lives alone will put things down in pairs? Don't ask me why. My wife says it's because conversation needs partners. 2 glasses, 2 coasters, 2 pencils. He held up his own single, stubby pencil, as if it were an odd bachelor at a dance. Mr. Bellamy lived alone? Renee nodded. Yes, Lieutenant. Then maybe he was expecting company, Columbo said mildly. Or maybe company had already been and gone. He let the idea sit like a cat on a sunlit stair and turned to the shelves instead. His finger traced air above the rows. Mystery authors, travelogues, a thin volume on clocks. He liked clocks, Columbo murmured. They call 'em some people, clocks do, regular, honest. Julian cleared his throat softly, but in the quiet room the sound wore polished shoes. Lieutenant, he said, urbane as a salon, this is all very lyrical, but does it bring us closer to an answer? Oh, yes, sir, Columbo said, almost relieved to be asked. Closer every minute. Only he lifted a shoulder. It's not the big facts that get me there. It's the little ones that stick. I get one under my collar, bothers me all day. He scratched his neck for the example. Like this, everyone says they went to bed around 11:30. But the brandy, he tipped his head toward the decanter. It's warmer than the room. That means it was poured, 20 minutes before the shot? Maybe less. Somebody stayed up for a nightcap, or came back for one. He looked at Julian gently. You're a nightcap man, Mr. Parr. I prefer tea, Julian said, unbothered. It forgives the hour. Tea, Columbo repeated, approving. Smart. My doctor, he's always after me about coffee at night. He made a note that might have been tea, or might have been nothing at all. And the robe nice one, by the way. I couldn't help noticing there's no pocket. Julian blinked. Should there be? Oh, I don't know, Columbo said. Mine's got one. I keep matches in it. Only there's no ash in your room's wastebasket. And Mr. Bellamy's cigar box had one missing. Brand's called a Rigoletto same as the little band I found by the back staircase. His voice stayed mild. His eyes did not. Funny place to lose a cigar band. For the first time a faint current moved beneath Julian's skin. It was gone at once, the water smoothing, but ripples had memory. Soot clings to anything, Julian said. Perhaps a draft carried it. Could be, Columbo agreed, as though Julian had rescued him from worry. Houses, they make their own weather. He stepped aside, offering the scene to the others, then drifted again, a tide choosing its shore. He turned to Maeve with that same gentle courtesy. Miss Delaney, your window last night faced the garden? Yes, you sleep with it open. In the rain? She smiled. I like the sound, but not the damp. Right, he said, content. And Mr. Reed Thomas, your door sticks a little. You noticed? Thomas blinked. I've only used it once. Well, it sticks, Columbo said. Took me 2 tries. Thing is, those little things, sticking doors, squeaky hinges, they're timekeepers. They tell you how fast a person was moving, how many tries they took. Mr. Parr's door? He raised his eyebrows. Silent as a library. You got a habit of oiling hinges, sir. Julian offered a thin smile. I don't travel with a toolkit, Lieutenant. No, of course. Columbo patted his pockets, discovered nothing of use, then brightened at a thought. Just one more thing, if you'll indulge me. He returned to the desk and, without touching the pages, admired the neat stack. Mr. Bellamy, he was particular. The kind of man who lines up his pencils, squares his paper. But this brass clip? He crouched, eye level with the manuscript. It's turned half a notch. Nothing to lose sleep over. Except earlier, when I first came in, it was straight. I notice those things. It's a problem. He turned, eyes kind and curious. Anyone lean on the desk? Rest a hand there? It's not a crime, it's just a clue that wants company. Silence. Renee shook his head. Maeve frowned gently, replaying her memory and finding no such gesture. Thomas looked baffled by the very idea of a clip's position mattering. Julian's gaze flicked to the pages and back. I couldn't say. Can't either, Columbo said. Not yet. He tapped the notebook shut. You've been very helpful. I don't want to keep you from breakfast. Just if you think of anything that isn't important, call me right away. It's usually the unimportant things that solve my day. They began to drift, released like kites when wind slackens. The room breathed again, but Julian remained seated, smoothing an invisible crease from his trouser knee, his calm now slightly overpolished, like a smile that's been held too long for a photograph. Columbo paused in the doorway and turned back, as though ambushed by a thought. "Mr. Parr, begging your pardon, what did you do with the string?" Julian looked up. "String?" "The cigar band," Columbo said, as if embarrassed by his own persistence. "They come off cleaner with a bit of string slipped under the glue. My uncle taught me that. There's often a piece lying around after. But I didn't find one. Not in the study, not by the back stairs." Julian's composure thinned by a hair. "I don't smoke cigars, Lieutenant. I write about them, sometimes when a novelist insists on flaunting one in Chapter 3. But I don't smoke them." "Sure, sure," Columbo said warmly. "I figured as much. Your voice no gravel." He smiled, almost apologizing to the air. "It's nothing. Just one of those things that bothers me. Like my missing cigar." He patted his pockets again, making a little theater of failure. "Ah, well, it'll turn up." He left them with the soft scrape of saws on old wood, a man more interested in windows than guilt. The house resumed its cautious tranquillity. In the drawn breath he abandoned unease, took a modest seat beside Julian Parr, and crossed its legs, prepared to stay. Maeve, watching from the hall, whispered to Thomas, "He's kind." Thomas nodded. And relentless. Renee carried fresh cups into the morning room, the clatter deliberately cheerful. Beyond the French doors the garden brightened, rain beads turning to pearls in the sun dot in the study. Columbo lingered one last moment alone, gazing at the manuscript's shifted clip, the patient glass of water, the tiny crescent polish on the hinge. He touched none of it. He only listened to the house, to the rhythm of his own questions, to the silence that follows when a veneer begins, imperceptibly, to peel. Then he smiled, tired, gentle, almost grateful, and murmured to the empty room, "Thank you," as though it had already told him everything he needed. And now it was only a matter of finding the person who had tried too hard to keep things quiet. Chapter 6. The Smile in the Mirror. The murderer watches Columbo leave, smiling faintly at his own reflection, certain he's gotten away with it. The door closed behind. Lieutenant Columbo with the soft click of finality, the kind of sound that tells a house it can breathe again. His footsteps receded down the gravel path, unhurried and uneven, fading into the sleepy hush of the evening. The rain had stopped hours ago, leaving behind air that smelled faintly of earth and smoke, a quiet balm for restless thoughts. Inside, the study exhaled. The clock ticked with patient certainty. The fire, rebuilt by careful hands, sighed into a steady rhythm of flame and shadow. The room, so recently crowded with tension, felt almost grateful for its solitude. The faint scent of cigar smoke, Columbo's misplaced signature, lingered near. The window, like a question left unanswered. Julian Parr stood perfectly still in that silence, his reflection watching him from the tall, gilt-edged mirror across the room. For a long moment, neither man moved. Both waited for the other to speak. Then Julian smiled, a soft, private smile. the kind that doesn't reach the eyes but feels sincere enough to deceive even the mirror. He's a charming fool, Julian said quietly, as though to an audience that needed reassuring. His voice carried the weight of elegance, each syllable measured and perfectly balanced. Charming, but harmless. He took a slow breath, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, the ritual of a man reasserting control after the tremor of intrusion. Columbo's presence, for all its apparent clumsiness, had disturbed the air. But now, with the detective gone, the balance returned. Order, that precious element of Julian's life, was restored. He turned slightly toward the desk, Arthur Bellamy's desk, now bare of evidence but still heavy with implication. The brass clip gleamed faintly under the lamplight, straightened once again to its rightful alignment. Julian allowed himself a small, approving nod. There is a certain art to tidiness, and tonight he had practiced it to perfection. Columbo had noticed things, of course. The man noticed everything. The tilt of a hinge, the scent of brandy, the warmth of a glass. Yet there had been something almost tender about his questions, as though curiosity were a form of kindness. He asked, he wondered, he laughed. Nothing in his tone had resembled accusation. Only a lingering curiosity, wrapped in apologies. Julian reached for the decanter, poured himself a measure of brandy, and let the warmth bloom across his palms. "He suspects nothing," he murmured almost affectionately. "Not a thing." He crossed to the mirror again, brandy in hand, and examined his reflection. The man staring back at him looked composed, scholarly, untouchable. The slight shadow under his eyes could have been fatigue. The faint line at the corner of his mouth could have been thoughtfulness. The kind of face, Julian mused, that could sit through a murder investigation and still be invited to the next dinner party. He raised a glass in a quiet salute to himself. To order, he whispered, and to art. The mirror obliged him with the same faint smile. The house was still, save for the occasional whisper of wind through the chimney. Somewhere upstairs Maeve moved, the sound of her door closing, perhaps. Reen's careful footsteps faded down the corridor toward the kitchen. Each sound folded itself into the calm, respectful hush of a house learning to live with absence. Julian took another sip, savoring it, then set the glass down. His reflection watched with approval. There was no tremor in his hand, no shadow of guilt in the curve of his mouth. Only poise. He had always believed that composure was the final proof of innocence. Not moral innocence, of course, but the kind that persuaded others to stop asking questions. He replayed the evening in his mind like a critic, revisiting a performance. Columbo's gentle voice, the soft scratch of his pencil, the way his eyes darted everywhere but the obvious place. "You've got a lovely house," the lieutenant had said on his way out, smiling, fumbling with his coat. "And you know, Mr. Parr, I've read some of your reviews. Sharp stuff. You see things other folks miss. That's a gift." Julian chuckled quietly. "So do you, Lieutenant," he had wanted to reply. But only after it's too late. Now, alone with the fire, he let the laughter come. It was low and musical, a sound that could have belonged to contentment rather than cruelty. He sat, leaned back, and allowed the warmth of the brandy to weave through his chest. There was pleasure in reflection, in the artistry of what he had accomplished. The plan had been simple, elegant, and final. Lila's death had drawn every eye, every whisper, every headline. Arthur's had been the second act, the quieter one, the necessary closing of the curtain. And now, with Columbo gone, the stage was dark again. Perfect. Julian's gaze drifted toward the manuscript on the desk. The perfect alibi. The title still mocked him with its irony, though not unkindly. A fitting epitaph, he said softly, tracing the air above it with his fingertip. For both of us. He rose, walked toward the mirror once more, and straightened his tie. Outside, a dog barked somewhere in the distance, a lonely domestic sound that made the world seem smaller, safer. The mirror caught the faintest twitch of his mouth as he smiled again. It was not the smile of triumph, nor of joy. It was the smile of a man who believes in his own cleverness enough to rest Dot behind him. The wind stirred the curtains, carrying with it the faintest trace of cigar smoke. Columbo's smoke. It drifted lazily through the air, circling once before vanishing near the lamp. Julian watched it go, his reflection steady, undisturbed. "You missed your chance, Lieutenant," he whispered. "You always do." Then he turned off the lamp, leaving the room bathed in firelight and shadow. The mirror, now faint and silvered by flame, kept the last image of his smile, that faint, deliberate curve, as though recording it for the record books of irony. Outside, on the gravel, Columbo's car engine turned over. A faint cough, a sputter, and then a smooth, steady hum. The sound lingered, moved away down the long driveway, and dissolved into the mist beyond the gate. Julian stood listening until the silence felt whole again. He exhaled slowly, ran a hand over his hair, and let his shoulders drop in the calm of finality. The mirror reflected his ease, his mastery, his calm. Everything, it seemed, was as it should be, and then, just before he turned away, he noticed it, a small smudge on the lower edge of the mirror's frame, faint, oily, unmistakable. A fingerprint. Not his. A faint scent of cigar smoke clung to it. Julian blinked, the calm faltering only for a breath. Then the smile returned, thinner this time, but still there. "Clever man," he said quietly. Clever, but too late. The fire crackled gently in reply. The brandy shimmered in the glass. And the mirror, ever loyal, held his reflection steady, the smile still in place, serene and untroubled, as though even the truth itself had decided to stay quiet for the night. Chapter 7. The Clue That Wasn't There. A single object missing from the crime scene gnaws at Columbo's instinct, like a splinter under the skin. The morning sun filtered gently through gauzy curtains, spilling gold over the quiet wreckage of last night's investigation. The Bellamy estate had been transformed from a mansion of laughter to a museum of silence. Dust motes floated lazily in the soft air, spinning through shafts of light as if time itself had chosen to move a little slower here. Lieutenant Columbo stood in the study, coat rumpled, hair in its usual polite disarray. He looked as ever like a man who had wandered into the wrong house and stayed because no one had the heart to turn him away. His fingers toyed absently with a stub of cigar that wasn't lit, just a prompt for thinking. The crime scene had been cleared, catalogued, sealed, and released, but something about it wouldn't let him rest. It wasn't the gun. It wasn't the angle of the wound. It wasn't even the time of death. No, it was something smaller, quieter, like a note missing from a familiar tune. He walked slowly across the carpet, the soles of his shoes whispering against the threads. The desk gleamed, its surface a careful reconstruction of order. The decanter, the half-filled glass, the manuscript titled The Perfect Alibi, all sat exactly where they should. Everything matched the reports. Everything fit neatly into the picture painted by the night. And yet, Columbo scratched his head, squinting toward the fireplace. The ashes glowed faintly, gray and fragile. "Funny thing," he muttered, half to himself. "You ever notice when people clean up, they always miss just one thing? Not a big thing, just one." He bent, tracing a finger along the cool marble edge of the hearth. The smell of smoke lingered, sweet and old, but something in it was wrong, a note too sharp, like perfume hiding something else. "Lieutenant?" came a voice from the doorway. It was Sergeant Keller, crisp and young, his uniform still stiff from starch. Columbo straightened slowly, brushing dust from his knees. "Oh, morning, Keller. Didn't see you there. You said you wanted another look before we file it," Keller said. "Anything missing?" Columbo gave a small shrug, half-smile tugging at his lips. "That's just it. I don't know. But something is." Keller frowned, glancing around. "Everything's accounted for, sir. Weapon, glass, decanter, papers, even the bullet casing." Yeah, I saw all that," Columbo said softly, pacing again. "But there's a space on the bookshelf there, see? Between those two travel books." He pointed with his cigar. "You ever see a shelf like that in a house like this? Gaps make me nervous." Keller leaned in. Indeed, a narrow rectangle of paler wood interrupted the even rows of spines. A missing book. One absent volume among hundreds. "Could have been borrowed," Keller suggested. "Could have?" Columbo echoed thoughtfully. "Or could have been something he didn't want anyone else reading after he was gone." He stepped closer, running a finger along the edges of the remaining books. The dust line was clean, recent. The gap had been made in the last few days, maybe last night. Keller took notes, efficient and brisk. Columbo, meanwhile, stood still as a statue, eyes half closed, listening to the silence. He had that faraway look he got when the answer was whispering, but he couldn't quite hear the words. Finally he spoke, voice soft as if confiding in the room itself. "You ever lose something, Keller, and not even know what it was until it came back to you?" "That's what this feels like." The sergeant smiled faintly. "Can't say I have, sir." "Well," Columbo said, shrugging again, "you're young. It'll happen." He moved toward the desk, his gaze drawn again to the manuscript. The title page gleamed up at him, pristine and self-satisfied. The Perfect Alibi. He tapped the paper once with his cigar, as if asking it a private question. "Mr. Bellamy," he murmured, "you were a man who liked neat endings. So why leave me an empty space?" Outside, the garden shimmered under a slow breeze. The roses, heavy with dew, leaned toward the windows, their petals opening in patient grace. Somewhere a sparrow sang, thin, uncertain, but hopeful. The world, it seemed, wanted peace, but Columbo's mind wouldn't grant it. He sat down in the chair opposite the desk, Arthur Bellamy's chair, and leaned back, eyes closed. He could still smell the faint trace of brandy, the ghost of cigar smoke. He pictured the evening, the laughter, the toast, the smile that must have come just before the shot. He pictured Julian Parr's calm eyes and polished voice, the ease with which he had answered every question, and then he pictured the missing space on the shelf, a void, a silence where there should have been words. "Lieutenant?" Keller prompted, pen poised. Columbo opened one eye, smiling faintly. "Oh, it's probably nothing. Just a book, right?" But the look in his eye betrayed him. That flicker of restlessness that meant he'd found a thread, even if it was still invisible to everyone else. He rose slowly, adjusting his coat, patting the pockets as if checking for something that wasn't there. "You ever get a splinter, Keller?" "A splinter, sir?" "Yeah, tiny thing. Doesn't hurt much, doesn't bleed. But you can't stop thinking about it till you get it out." He turned toward the door, the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That's what this case is. A splinter." Keller followed him out, shaking his head, but Columbo lingered at the doorway one last time. His gaze drifted back to the empty space on the shelf, to the dustless line and the question it whispered. "Something was here," he murmured, "and whoever took it thought I wouldn't notice." He tipped his head, as if listening to an answer only he could hear, then smiled, slow, thoughtful, almost tender. "But I always notice." Outside, the day stretched calm and golden. The gravel crunched beneath his shoes as he walked to his car, the old engine coughing awake like a loyal friend. He slid behind the wheel, humming under his breath, eyes narrowing in the sun. A missing book, a perfect alibi, and a smile that had lingered too long in a mirror. Small things, maybe. But Columbo lived for small things, and as he drove away down the long, sunlit driveway, the breeze lifted behind him, rustling through the roses like the faint sound of pages turning. Somewhere in the quiet of that elegant house, the missing clue still waited, or perhaps it was never there at all. Chapter 8. Secrets of the Typewriter A. Seemingly innocuous typewriter ribbon hides the truth about a forged note found beside the body. The rain had returned, soft and persistent, washing the edges of the world into gentler shapes. The Bellamy estate sat wrapped in mist, its windows glowing faintly through the haze like lanterns on a forgotten pier. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and polish, the careful calm that follows chaos. Lieutenant Columbo stood in Arthur Bellamy's study once again, the familiar rumple of his coat blending with the subdued disorder of the room. A few officers moved quietly in the background, murmuring to one another, their voices respectful and distant. On the desk lay the typewriter, an elegant black Underwood, its keys gleaming in the half-light, the paper rolled neatly in place. Columbo leaned close to it, his breath fogging the cool metal. "You know," he said softly, "I never met a typewriter that didn't have a story to tell." He tapped one key lightly. It clicked back with a crisp sound, sharp, confident, alive. "Beautiful machine," he murmured. "You can always tell the kind of man who owns one. Mr. Bellamy, he was precise. Never a typo, never a smudge. The note beside the body, found hours earlier, had been short, elegant, and final. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused. Forgive me. A.B. It had the right rhythm for suicide. The words fit the man. But Columbo's instinct twitched, the way a thread might catch on a splinter. Something in the tone, or perhaps in the perfection, didn't feel right. He turned to Sergeant Keller, who stood by the door, holding a folder of reports. "You said the note was typed on this?" "Yes, sir." "Matches the ribbon perfectly. Same machine, same ink pattern. Forensics confirmed." Columbo nodded absently. "That's good work, Keller. Real good work." He paused, rubbing his temple with the back of his hand. "But here's the thing. Did they check both sides of the ribbon? Keller blinked. Both sides, sir? Sure. You see, these ribbons, they don't just print one layer of letters. The ink's soaked through. You can wind 'em, use 'em again. Kind of like second chances. He smiled faintly. The world doesn't hand out many of those. Keller looked puzzled, but obedient. We can get the lab to... Oh, no. Don't trouble, M. I'll take a peek myself. Columbo fished in his pocket, produced a pair of thin gloves that looked as though they'd lived there for months, and fitted them on. Carefully he rolled the platen, winding the ribbon forward a few inches. The faint, ghostly impressions of letters shimmered there, backward, overlapping but readable if one squinted just right. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "Well, look at that," he murmured. "Our Mr. Bellamy was a busy man. But he didn't write this note himself. Not this one." Keller stepped closer. "Sir?" Columbo pointed. "See there? Right above the line, that word, forgive. And right before it, there's another line that doesn't belong. Can you make it out?" Keller squinted. "Looks like Draft 4 complete. And initials J.P.?" "Julian Parr," Columbo said softly, almost kindly, as if the name itself had confessed. He sat back, running a hand over his hair. "Funny thing about writers. They can fake anything except another writer's rhythm. Arthur Bellamy wrote in complete thoughts. Perfect little packages. Mr. Parr, on the other hand, he smiled faintly. He edits even when he kills." The room fell still except for the steady hum of rain against the windows. Columbo walked to the window, his reflection blurred beside the mist. "You know, Keller, I liked Mr. Parr. Polite, elegant, never in a hurry. But it's always the tidy ones who slip. They think order hides everything. Trouble is, order leaves fingerprints." Keller nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "So the note was forged?" "Oh, absolutely," Columbo said, turning back toward the desk. "Typed on Bellamy's machine, using his paper, his ribbon, but the hand behind it belonged to someone else. And not just anyone. Someone who knew his habits well enough to mimic them. Someone who spent enough time in this study to feel at home here." He bent again, examining the keys. A few of them bore fresh smudges, particularly the G and V. He touched them lightly, noting the faint trace of darker oil. A gentleman critic with delicate fingers, but not delicate enough. "I'd wager he typed the note right here after the shot, maybe even before help was called." Keller exhaled. "That's cold, sir." Columbo sighed, his voice as soft as the rain. "Cold's not the word I'd use. Careful, maybe." He thought it through. Only he forgot that a machine keeps secrets. It remembers who pressed which key. You just have to ask it politely. He rolled the ribbon one more time, studying the faint progression of words buried beneath. There it was, Draft 4 complete, Lila's chapter, Arthur to approve. Then a pause, and finally the suicide note. As if layered one upon another, guilt upon deception, Columbo replaced the ribbon, smoothing it with a care that bordered on reverence. "You know," he said softly, "I think Mr. Bellamy's typewriter just told us who killed him." He straightened, stretching his back with a quiet groan. "I'll pay Mr. Parr another visit. Nothing formal, of course. Just conversation. My wife says I'm good at those." Keller allowed himself a small smile. You think he'll crack, Lieutenant? Oh, I don't know, Keller. Columbo reached for his raincoat, brushing off invisible dust. People like Mr. Parr don't crack. They unfold, slowly, like ribbon. He turned toward the window where the rain had begun again, gentle, deliberate, cleansing. The light caught on the typewriter's chrome, glinting once like a wink. Columbo noticed, nodded faintly, and smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Bellamy," he murmured. "I knew you'd leave me something." And as he stepped out into the mist, the typewriter sat quietly in the empty study, its keys resting, its ribbon holding the final truth, words no one had meant to write, preserved forever in silence. Chapter 9: Coffee with a Killer. Over a friendly chat. Columbo's bumbling charm disarms the suspect, but his notebook is filling up fast. The cafe on the corner was one of those places that seemed to exist, outside of time, all soft jazz and murmuring voices. The clink of spoons on porcelain, the faint perfume of roasted beans and polished wood. Rain tapped against the windows in lazy rhythms, turning the world beyond into watercolor. Inside it was warm and gentle, the kind of warmth that forgives even the grayest morning. Lieutenant Columbo sat across from Julian Parr, his raincoat draped over the back of his chair, a cigar stub resting in his fingers like a forgotten thought. His hair was more untidy than usual, his tie a little crooked, his smile faintly apologetic. He looked, as always, harmless, which was precisely how he wanted to look. Julian, impeccable as ever, stirred his coffee with deliberate grace. "I must say, Lieutenant, I wasn't expecting you to suggest such a civilized venue for interrogation." "Oh, no, nothing like that," Columbo said quickly, waving his hand as if brushing away the idea. "I just thought, maybe we both could use a break. Can't think on an empty stomach. My wife, she swears coffee fixes everything, even murder investigations." He smiled sheepishly. "Between you and me, I think she's right about that." Julian's laughter was smooth, cultured. "Then let's call this a truce. A meeting of minds over caffeine." "Beautiful," Columbo said, nodding. "I like that. A meeting of minds." The waiter arrived with 2 steaming cups. Columbo's was crowded with sugar packets, which he tore open absent-mindedly, pouring in one after another, until the liquid glistened like syrup. "You ever notice," he said conversationally, stirring slowly, "how every place makes coffee a little different? My wife says that's what makes life interesting." Julian smiled politely, but his eyes were sharp, measuring. "You must find a great deal of interest in your line of work." "Oh, sure," Columbo said lightly. "But I'm not what you'd call a deep thinker, Mr. Parr. I just pay attention to little things. You'd be surprised how often the little things trip people up." Julian raised an eyebrow, amused. "Little things?" Columbo leaned forward, lowering his voice to a comfortable murmur. "Like that typewriter ribbon, for example. You remember that old machine in Mr. Bellamy's study? Beautiful piece of work. They don't make 'em like that anymore." Julian's fingers paused on the cup's handle, almost imperceptibly. "Yes, I recall it. Well, you see, the lab boys tell me something funny." Columbo looked mildly embarrassed, as if confessing a clumsy mistake. "They've found the same note typed twice, once in the ribbon's ghost, once on the page. First time's got a different rhythm, a little pause between 'forgive' and 'me', like whoever wrote it wasn't sure what to say next. Happens to me all the time when I'm trying to write an anniversary card. You wouldn't believe how long I'd take just to say sorry." Julian gave a small chuckle, though his grip on the cup tightened slightly. Perhaps Arthur was uncertain. Guilt makes poets of us all. Yeah, could be," Columbo agreed, nodding amiably. "Only thing is, Mr. Bellamy never used that typewriter ribbon twice. He was a one-and-done kind of guy. You know, perfectionist. So I got to wondering, why'd he roll it back?" Julian looked at him evenly. "And what conclusion did you reach, Lieutenant?" "Oh, nothing much yet," Columbo said, eyes twinkling behind his apparent confusion. "Just seems funny, that's all. A man writes a goodbye note, then someone else types over the same ribbon later. Like the ribbon's telling two stories at once." He took a sip of his overly sweet coffee, grimaced at the taste, and smiled as if it didn't matter. "Stories are funny that way, huh? You write enough of them, they start writing you back." Julian tilted his head, offering a thin smile. "I admire your poetic turn of phrase." "Ah, you're too kind," Columbo said, pulling out his little notebook and flipping it open. "Just jotting something down, don't mind me. I get ideas like this, sometimes silly ones. My wife says I should have been a writer instead of a cop, but I tell her, honey, no one would read a mystery if they already knew who did it." He chuckled softly. "Takes the fun right out." Julian watched him quietly. The detective's words drifted through the air like the lazy spirals of steam above their cups, gentle, meandering, impossible to grasp. Yet beneath that surface calm, something sharper gleamed. The notebook pages fluttered softly as Columbo scribbled, small notes, half-formed thoughts, details only he understood. Finally, Columbo looked up. His tone was almost wistful. "You know, Mr. Parr, there's one thing about truth. It's like cream and coffee. You can stir it all you want, but sooner or later it rises to the top." Julian smiled thinly, lifting his cup in a silent toast. "Then let us hope, Lieutenant, that you like your coffee strong." "Oh, I do," Columbo said, smiling back. "Especially when it keeps me awake." Outside, the rain began again, slow, rhythmic, almost soothing. Inside the cafe, two men sipped their coffee in comfortable silence. One believed he was safe. The other knew better, and his notebook was nearly full. Chapter 10. The Widow's Whisper. A grieving spouse confides something she wasn't meant to say. And the case takes a darker turn. The evening was tender and quiet, as though the house itself were trying not to disturb the memory of its late master. A faint drizzle brushed against the windows, turning the world outside into a watercolor of silver and gray. Lieutenant Columbo stood in the doorway of the sitting room, hat in hand, coat slightly damp, voice soft enough to match the mood of the place. Across from him sat Eleanor Bellamy, Arthur's widow. She looked delicate in her grief, a ghost of the woman who had once filled this house with warmth and art. Her black dress was simple, her hands folded neatly in her lap. On the table between them, a teapot steamed quietly, breathing comfort into the silence. Columbo shifted his weight, as though reluctant to intrude. "Mrs. Bellamy, I hope I'm not coming at a bad time. I know this can't be easy." She gave a faint smile, the kind that trembles before it disappears. "It's quite all right, Lieutenant. Talking helps. The house feels too large when it's quiet." "Yeah," Columbo said softly. "I know that feeling. My wife, she can't stand silence either. Says it gives the furniture too many opinions." He smiled, and for the first time, she almost laughed. He poured himself a cup of tea, awkward but gentle, stirring it with the slow rhythm of someone who never quite learned to sit still. "It's a beautiful house you've got here, ma'am. I can see why Mr. Bellamy loved it. Full of character." He looked around, eyes wandering, not like a detective, but like a guest too polite to stare. "You must miss him terribly." "I do," she said. Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed. Arthur was complicated, but he had a good heart. He loved his work, his stories, his quiet. Sometimes, she added, eyes lowering to her tea, "I think he loved those things more than people." Columbo nodded. "Writers, huh?" "My nephew's one. Always got his head somewhere else. You talk to him and you get about half his attention. The other half's out chasing ideas." She smiled again, but this time there was something fragile in it. Arthur was like that. Except... She stopped herself. The pause hung in the air, soft but noticeable. Columbo looked up from his cup, his brow furrowing just enough to seem puzzled, but not pressing. "Except?" She exhaled. "Except lately, he'd been frightened. He wouldn't say it outright, but I could tell. He'd started locking his study at night. That wasn't like him." Columbo blinked, pretending surprise. "Locked it, huh? Even from you?" She hesitated, then nodded. "He said it was for his manuscripts. But I knew better. He was meeting someone. A man, I think. They argued once, here, in that very room." Her eyes drifted to the study door, now closed, as if it were still listening. "I wasn't supposed to hear it, but I did." Columbo leaned forward slightly, his tone still gentle. "You wouldn't happen to remember what they argued about, would you?" Her gaze turned inward, searching memory. "Something about words, about a story. Arthur said, 'You can't rewrite life, Julian.'" She stopped, realizing too late what she had said. "Julian?" Columbo asked softly, as if he hadn't heard the name before. "Julian Parr, the critic?" She paled. "I shouldn't have said that. Arthur made me promise not to repeat it. He said it would ruin someone's career." "Oh, no, no," Columbo said quickly, voice warm and reassuring. "You've done fine, Mrs. Bellamy, perfectly fine. I just get curious about details, that's all. My wife says I worry too much about small things. Drives her crazy." He smiled again, the harmless kind of smile that never frightens. But inside, a small light had clicked on, the kind that never goes out once it's lit. Julian Parr, the man of polished manners, poised words, and calm nerves. The man whose robe had no pocket, but whose fingers had left ink smudges on a typewriter key. Columbo finished his tea, setting the cup down gently. "You've been very kind, Mrs. Bellamy, and you've helped me more than you know. I'm sorry to make you talk about hard things." Eleanor looked up, eyes glistening, her voice barely a whisper. "Lieutenant, do you think Arthur knew he was going to die?" Columbo hesitated, hat in hand. His eyes softened. "Maybe he did, ma'am. Maybe he just didn't know when." He tipped his head respectfully, then turned toward the door, his steps soft as rain. Behind him the widow sat still, one hand pressed to her lips, as if trying to catch the words that had slipped free. Outside, the drizzle turned into a steady mist. Columbo paused under the porch, eyes distant, breath fogging in the cool air. His notebook waited in his pocket, already half full, and in the margin he wrote one name, circled twice, Julian Parr, Chapter 11, A House Built on Lies. Columbo Revisits the Mansion. Each room telling a different story, none of them quite true. The sky hung low and quiet when Lieutenant Columbo returned to the Bellamy estate. The rain had stopped, but the air still shimmered with its memory, that clean, silvery stillness that makes every sound feel gentler. His old car sighed as it came to rest on the gravel. He stepped out, coat flapping lightly in the breeze. Cigar stub perched between his fingers like an afterthought. The mansion loomed ahead. Beautiful but tired, a house that had seen too many emotions pressed into its walls. Columbo tilted his head as he looked at it, as though listening to something the building itself was trying to say. "Funny thing about houses," he murmured. "They always remember who lied inside them." Inside, the air was scented faintly with lemon oil and old paper. The servants had straightened everything since the last time, but order couldn't quite disguise unease. A hush seemed to follow the detective as he moved. Not fear exactly, but the kind of silence that waits to see what happens next. He began in the dining room, where the dinner party had sparkled and died. The chandelier gleamed overhead, every crystal painstakingly polished, yet somehow colder now. Columbo ran a finger along the back of a chair, pausing at a faint scuff on the leg. "That's new," he said softly to no one. "Somebody stood up in a hurry that night." His notebook appeared, and a quiet line joined the others on the page. From there, he wandered into the study, the heart of the mystery. The fire was gone, replaced by a faint scent of ash and dust. The desk stood neat and proud, as though daring anyone to accuse it of knowing too much. The typewriter waited patiently, a silent accomplice. Columbo's reflection caught in its black enamel, tired eyes, curious eyes, and he smiled faintly at himself. "You ever notice," he said, tapping the typewriter key, "machines don't lie. People do." Upstairs, the bedrooms told their own tales. In the widow's room, faint traces of perfume still lingered, soft, melancholy, honest. Her grief had settled into the fabric of the curtains, the quiet pulse of someone left behind. Columbo touched the edge of a photograph on the dresser, Arthur and Eleanor smiling on a garden path, years younger, innocent of endings. He placed it back exactly where it had been, his heart heavy but calm. Across the hall, Julian Parr's guest room was the opposite, immaculate, almost too precise. A single book on the bedside table. No dust, no clutter, no fingerprints. "Too clean," Columbo muttered. "Like a stage after the play's done." He bent and noticed a faint mark near the wardrobe, the ghost of a suitcase wheel, faint but fresh. Somebody packed to leave before the curtain fell. He returned downstairs, retracing his steps, listening to the house breathe. Each room spoke differently, polite contradictions, refined deceits. Together they formed a single, unsteady truth. This house had never been one of peace. Only performance dot at the front door. Columbo paused, glancing back one last time. "A house built on lies," he whispered, almost kindly. "But lies don't hold forever." He tucked his notebook away, pulled his coat tighter, and stepped into the pale morning light, the house watching him leave, still pretending it had nothing left to hide. Chapter Footprints in the rain. A sudden downpour washes away evidence. But not before Columbo notices a set of footprints that don't match. The rain came without warning, not a storm, not even a tantrum of clouds, just a heavy, quiet curtain that descended upon the Bellamy estate like a sigh. The garden paths blurred, the roses bowed, and the gravel drive turned soft underfoot. Every surface gleamed, polished by the weather's gentle persistence. Lieutenant Columbo stood beneath the porch, hat low, coat collar turned up, his cigar unlit, but present, always present. The mist clung to his shoulders like an old friend. "You ever notice," he said softly to no one in particular, "rain's got a way of cleaning up after people, and sometimes it cleans up too well." He took a cautious step down onto the wet gravel. The rhythmic patter of droplets on the brim of his hat filled the silence. Somewhere in the distance thunder grumbled, not angry bees, just tired. The driveway curved toward the garden, where a row of stepping stones led to the side entrance of the house. Columbo's eyes, sharp beneath his drooping lids, caught something there, faint, fleeting impressions where the mud was deepest. Footprints, 2 sets, side by side. One pair was broad and heavy men's shoes, size 11, the kind Arthur Bellamy had favored. But beside them, overlapping slightly, was another set, smaller, narrower, the heel sharper. The kind you'd expect from a man more polished and practical. Julian Parr's kind of shoes. Columbo crouched, his knees cracking softly, a sound lost in the rain. He traced the edge of the print with a matchstick, thoughtful. "You ever notice how mud tells the truth, Keller?" he murmured to the sergeant who stood nearby, under an umbrella. "Yes, sir," Keller replied. "Right until the rain makes it forget." Columbo nodded slowly. "Exactly. That's the problem. Truth's got a short memory when the weather's bad." He reached out and touched the damp edge of the nearest print. The mud had begun to soften, the outlines blurring. Already, the smaller set was vanishing under the pooling rainwater. The detective sighed, straightened, and watched as nature did its quiet work of erasure. "Well," he said, stuffing his hands into his pockets, "that's what I get for being late." Keller frowned. "You think they were made last night?" "Maybe," Columbo said. "Or maybe early this morning. Hard to say now. But they were made by someone who didn't belong out here. Mr. Bellamy, rest his soul, didn't take walks in the rain, and he didn't share his path unless he had to." He glanced toward the house. The curtains in Julian Parr's guest room hung still, drawn against the weather. Behind them, Columbo imagined, the man himself was probably enjoying a dry seat, maybe a book, maybe a cup of coffee, and maybe, just maybe, wondering how much the rain would wash away, you know. Columbo said after a pause, "I've been thinking about shoes. Funny things, shoes. You can tell a lot about a person from them. How they walk, where they've been, how careful they are. My wife, she says I should get mine resoled, but I kinda like the wear. Reminds me where I've been." Keller smiled faintly. "You think the killer's shoes will tell us where he's been?" "Oh, they already did," Columbo said, glancing at the fading prints. "I just have to remember what they said before the rain forgets." He took out his notebook, damp around the edges, and scribbled a few words. Footprints. One too many. He tapped the page thoughtfully. "You ever get a feeling, Keller, that something wants to be found? Like the truth's whispering, but the world's got its hands over its ears. Keller tilted his umbrella toward him. All the time, sir. Columbo smiled, that small, weary smile that lived somewhere between amusement and certainty. Then let's listen a little harder. As they turned back toward the house, the last traces of the footprints melted into the earth. The rain continued its patient cleansing, wiping away everything but memory. But in Columbo's mind, the scene remained two sets of tracks, one belonging to a dead man, the other to someone too neat, too calm, too confident to belong in the mud. He lit his cigar at last, shielding it from the drizzle. The smoke curled upward, meeting the mist in a soft embrace. "You can wash away the prints," he murmured, "but not the path that made." The rain answered with another soft sigh, and the detective walked back into the mansion, the only man in the storm who knew that some truth, once seen, never wash away. Chapter 13. The art of forgetting the murderer's flawless memory. Slips one detail too precise, one correction too careful. The morning sunlight stretched across the study like a sigh, soft and golden, brushing the dust motes into gentle dance. Lieutenant Columbo stood by the window, one hand in his pocket, the other cradling a half-cold cup of coffee. He looked, as always, like a man halfway between thought and distraction, but his eyes were awake, quietly taking note of everything that didn't fit. Julian Parr sat across from him, calm as marble. His posture was perfect, his tone even. He had the sort of poise that belonged in lecture halls or parlors, never in police interviews. He had been patient, generous even, repeating his account of that terrible night for what felt like the 10th time. Every word was clean, every pause rehearsed. Columbo smiled faintly, notebook balanced in his hand. "You've got a wonderful memory, Mr. Parr. I mean that sincerely. Some folks can't even remember what they had for breakfast, and here you are remembering which candle was lit first on the dining table." Julian's lips curved slightly. "Details matter, Lieutenant. They make a story believable." Sure, Columbo said, nodding. "That's what my wife says about movies. She notices everything, the color of the drapes, what someone's wearing, even if the rain falls the same in every scene. Drives me nuts." He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "But you're different. You notice things because you lived them, huh?" Julian nodded once, confident. "Exactly." Columbo tapped his pencil lightly against the page. "Now, about that typewriter. You said it was still on Mr. Bellamy's desk when you came in after hearing the gunshot?" "Yes," Julian said smoothly. "The typewriter, the decanter, the glass, everything was as it had been earlier in the evening." "That's what I thought you said," Columbo replied casually. He flipped a page, eyes scanning his notes. "It's funny, though. Mrs. Bellamy remembered something a little different. She said the typewriter was usually kept in the corner by the bookshelf when not in use. Said Arthur was particular about his workspace." Julian's fingers tightened ever so slightly around the arm of the chair. "She must be mistaken," he said quickly. "Arthur was using it that night. He must have left it out." Columbo's brow furrowed, friendly but persistent. "Oh, that's what confuses me, sir. You see, the ribbon in that typewriter was turned back, rewound. Now, that doesn't happen unless somebody does it by hand, and a man doesn't usually rewind a ribbon after writing his last words." Julian's expression didn't falter, but something in his eyes shifted, a flicker too brief to name. Perhaps the police did it during their inspection. Maybe, Columbo said, his voice mild as milk. Only they didn't, I checked. He looked up then, his gaze soft but unwavering. You've got a terrific memory, Mr. Parr. You remember the table, the candles, the brand of wine, even which hand Bellamy used to pour it. But that typewriter, that one detail just keeps moving around. Julian leaned back, regaining composure. I suppose I must be mistaken. It's been a difficult week. Columbo smiled gently. Oh, I understand, sir. Believe me, I forget things all the time. My wife says my brain's like an old drawer. Everything's in there somewhere, but you've got to jiggle it to open. He closed his notebook softly. But you don't forget. Not ever. You just remember a little too well. Julian's eyes narrowed, calm but cold. What exactly are you implying, Lieutenant? Oh, nothing, Columbo said quickly, rising to his feet. Nothing at all. You've been a big help, really. Just one of those little things that bothers me. Can't shake it. He smiled kindly, tipping his head. Funny how memory works, isn't it? Sometimes it keeps too much. Sometimes it remembers things that didn't happen. He turned toward the door, his old coat swaying with each unhurried step. Behind him, Julian sat perfectly still, a man carved from self-control. Yet for the first time, the quiet around him didn't feel like confidence. It felt like the beginning of a crack. Columbo paused at the threshold, glancing back with that familiar, apologetic grin. Oh, just one more thing, Mr. Parr, he said gently. You said you heard the gunshot at 11:15, right? Julian nodded. That's correct. Columbo's smile widened a fraction. Then how'd you know the clock in the study had stopped at 11:12? He didn't wait for an answer. The door closed softly behind him, leaving the house filled with silence, and one man alone, remembering far more than he meant to. Chapter 14. Columbo's cigar burns. Late at night, Columbo sits in his car, cigarette smoke curling as he connects the dots no one else can see. The city had gone quiet, that special kind of stillness that comes only after midnight, when even the streetlights seem to hum more softly. A light mist hung over the pavement, catching the glow from passing cars and stretching it into pale ribbons of gold. In the dim light of the Bellamy Estates gate, Lieutenant Columbo's battered Peugeot sat idling, its headlights off, its wipers ticking in slow rhythm. Inside, Columbo leaned back in the driver's seat, coat rumpled, tie loosened, a thin spiral of smoke curling from the cigar between his fingers. The air smelled of rain and burnt tobacco, familiar, comforting scents to a man who spent most of his life thinking in silence. The car was warm, the windows fogged just enough to make the world outside feel distant. Manageable dot he rubbed at one of the small burns on his coat sleeve, a constellation of tiny marks that had followed him through half his career. That's the trouble with habits, he muttered softly. You don't notice until they leave a mark. The notebook sat open on the passenger seat, pages filled with his small, looping handwriting, pieces of the puzzle scattered across the paper like breadcrumbs. He tapped the pencil against the edge of the steering wheel, thinking. The rain drummed lightly on the roof, steady as a heartbeat. Let's see now, he murmured to himself, voice low and thoughtful. A missing book? A rewound ribbon. footprints that don't belong, and a man who remembers a little too much. He exhaled a slow stream of smoke, watching it twist upward in the glow of the dashboard light. Each detail floated in his mind, separate but shimmering, waiting to connect, waiting to make sense. The car creaked as he shifted, pulling the note he'd taken from the study, the supposed suicide letter. He laid it on the notebook, reading it again for the 10th time. The words looked neat, practiced, artificial. "Forgive me," it said, but there was no feeling in the phrase, no tremor of truth. Columbo's eyes softened. "You were a writer, Mr. Bellamy," he said quietly. "You chose your words like a craftsman, and you wouldn't have chosen these." Outside, a light wind moved through the trees, carrying the faint scent of wet earth. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then went still. The night stretched long, gentle, unbroken. Columbo reached into the glove box, pulling out a small tape recorder. He pressed play. The faint click of a conversation filled the car, his earlier interview with Julian Parr. The voice was smooth, too smooth, recalling details that no innocent man would bother to remember. The glass was 3/4 full. Columbo repeated aloud, his voice almost affectionate. "That's the one that gets me. Nobody remembers a glass like that unless they poured it themselves." He smiled, slow and tired, the kind of smile that knew exactly where the road was headed, but wasn't in any rush to get there. He closed the notebook, tucked it in his coat pocket, and turned off the engine. The silence was kind, almost companionable. For a long moment he simply sat there, cigar glowing faintly in the dark, the smoke curling upward like thought made visible. He didn't need to chase the truth anymore. It was already circling him, quiet and inevitable. Like the smell of rain that lingered after the storm, he tapped ash into the tray, murmuring softly, "It's always the details, isn't it? The little burns no one else sees." And outside, under the slow drizzle and the whisper of wind, the detective's car waited, a small island of warmth in a sleeping city, with one man inside piecing together the final shape of a lie. Chapter 15. A smile too soon. The murderer grows overconfident. Toying with the lieutenant in conversation, unaware of the trap tightening. The morning broke soft and golden, sunlight spilling through the high windows of the Bellamy mansion like honey over glass. The rain was gone, leaving the garden below glistening and new. Birds returned to the hedges, singing as if the world had never known tragedy. Inside, the air was warm with the smell of fresh coffee and polished wood, a calm so complete it almost seemed deliberate. Julian Parr sat in the drawing-room, a picture of composed elegance. A newspaper rested loosely in his hands, though his eyes drifted often toward the clock. He was waiting, and he liked to wait. It made him feel in control. He had already replayed his last conversation with Lieutenant Columbo 6 times, each word turned over and examined like a jewel. The man was clever, yes, but predictable. When the doorbell rang, Julian's smile was ready. "Lieutenant," he greeted warmly as Columbo stepped inside, all raincoat and apologies. "You look tired. I hope you haven't been working too hard on this dreadful business." "Oh, it's no trouble at all, sir," Columbo said, rubbing the back of his neck. "You know, my wife says I'd get less tired if I didn't think so much. But between you and me, that's the only part of the job I'm any good at." Julian chuckled. "Well, perhaps you think too well." You'll have us all nervous before long." Columbo smiled modestly. "Oh, I don't think so, sir. You folks here, you've been real helpful. I just came by to clear up a couple of little things. Details. Never anything big." He settled into the chair opposite Julian, patting his pockets until he found his notebook. "Mind if I smoke?" "Not at all," Julian said, waving a graceful hand. "Though I must warn you, I don't partake myself." "Yeah, I figured," Columbo said, lighting the cigar. "A man like you, sharp mind, clean lungs. Makes sense." He puffed once, the smoke curling lazily between them. "It's just this one thing that's been bothering me. Probably nothing." Julian leaned back, smiling as if he were entertaining a friend. "You've said that before, Lieutenant. And somehow it always turns into something." Columbo laughed softly. "You noticed that, huh? My wife says the same thing." He flipped a page in his notebook, pretending to search. "Oh, yeah, here it is. The glass." Julian tilted his head. "The glass?" "Yeah, the brandy glass we found on Mr. Bellamy's desk. You told me it was half full when you found him. Remember that?" "I do," Julian said easily. "A small detail, but yes, half full." Columbo nodded slowly. "That's what's funny, sir. The lab says the prints were yours. Which is no crime, of course. You might have picked it up after trying to help. Only thing is, there was residue at the bottom lipstick." Julian blinked, the smile faltering just for a breath. "Lipstick?" "Yeah," Columbo said softly, almost kindly. "Mrs. Harrow wore that shade. Leila Harrow. Lovely woman by all accounts. You knew her, didn't you?" Julian's pause was too brief, too measured. "I knew her professionally. We'd worked together." Of course," Columbo said, waving a hand. "It's just funny. She didn't drink brandy, did she? That was your habit." Julian's smile returned, tighter this time. "You seem to know a great deal about habits, Lieutenant." "Oh, I do," Columbo said, puffing lightly on the cigar. "That's all this job is, really, habits. What people do without thinking. What they remember too clearly." He looked up then, eyes mild but unblinking. "You ever notice, Mr. Parr, that confidence is a kind of memory, too? You get so sure of what you said last time you forget to change the story." Julian's voice was smooth, but his hand trembled slightly as he folded the newspaper. "I'm not sure I follow." "Oh, I bet you do," Columbo said softly, almost apologetically. "You see, I've been thinking about that night. About the footprints in the garden, the typewriter ribbon, the missing book. You've explained everything so clearly, sir, almost too clearly." He smiled faintly. "Sometimes when a man explains something too well, it's because he's not trying to remember. He's trying to forget." Julian's jaw tightened, the smile gone now, replaced by polite restraint. "Lieutenant, are you accusing me of something?" "Oh, no, sir." "Not yet." Columbo stood, slipping the notebook into his coat pocket. "Just clearing up little things. My wife says it's the little things that'll kill me someday." He tipped his hat halfway to the door. "You've been real patient, Mr. Parr. Oh, just one more thing." Julian's breath caught. "Yes?" Columbo smiled kindly. "That glass on the desk, it wasn't half full. It was 3/4. You said so yourself the other day." The color drained from Julian's face. Columbo nodded slowly, almost regretfully. That's the trouble with a good memory, sir. Sometimes it remembers too much. And with that, the lieutenant slipped out into the sunlight, leaving behind only the faint smell of cigar smoke, and a man whose perfect composure had finally cracked Chapter 16. The tape recorder trick Columbo uncovers a staged phone call, the fatal timeline collapsing under scrutiny. The day began in a hush, the kind of slow morning where the light moves carefully through half-drawn curtains, rushing dust into soft gold. The Bellamy mansion had quieted again, its hallways breathing in rhythm with the ticking of distant clocks. Lieutenant Columbo stood in the study, raincoat draped over one arm, cigar unlit, eyes half-closed in thought. The typewriter sat where it always had, the desk polished, the telephone coiled neatly beside it. Everything appeared orderly, calm. But to Columbo, order had never been a sign of innocence, just the last pose before truth steps in. He touched the phone's receiver, lifting it gently, letting it rest against his ear. The faint hum of the dial tone whispered like static memory. "You know, funny thing," he muttered softly to himself, "phones don't lie, either. Not really. They just repeat what you feed 'em." From the doorway, Sergeant Keller appeared, carrying a manila folder and a cup of coffee. "Lab reports, Lieutenant, and the phone logs you asked for." "Ah, you're a lifesaver," Columbo said, smiling gratefully. "You ever notice, Keller, how coffee's always better when someone else brings it?" Keller grinned. "Yes, sir. My wife says the same thing." Columbo chuckled, taking a sip. "Smart woman. Hold on now, let's see here." He opened the folder, scanning the neatly printed lines. 11:14 p.m. That's when the call came in from Mr. Parr's room to Mr. Bellamy's study, supposedly. But look at this, the tape from the telephone exchange. He flipped the page toward Keller. Static, dead air, then the gunshot. But no voices. Keller frowned. Maybe the microphone failed? Columbo shook his head slowly, almost sadly. No, it didn't fail. It was never there. What we're hearing is a recording, not a live call. Somebody played the sound of conversation into the receiver, probably from one of these little pocket recorders. Old trick. My nephew uses it to prank his friends. He wandered to the desk, tracing the outline of the phone cord with a fingertip. See that? The cord's stretched. It was pulled tight to reach the typewriter. I'll bet my cigar that recorder sat right here, playing nice and steady while Mr. Parr made sure someone saw him somewhere else. Keller blinked. So the call was faked to make it seem Bellamy was alive after the shot? Exactly. Columbo nodded, voice low, thoughtful. Makes the time of death look later. Gives our critic friend an airtight alibi. He smiled faintly, admiration in his tone. It's clever. Too clever. He forgot one thing. Tape recorders don't talk back. He pressed the telephone's cradle gently, listening to the click. The sound on that tape, it's clean. No hesitation, no overlap. That's not a conversation. That's rehearsal. Outside, the wind shifted, stirring the curtains. The late morning light touched the detective's face, tracing the faint lines of tired satisfaction. "You know, Keller," he said quietly, "truth's got its own timing. No matter how you stretch it, it snaps back sooner or later." He reached for his notebook, scribbling a single line. Playback proves alibi false. Then he closed it, pocketing it with care. "Let's pay Mr. Parr another visit," he said. pulling on his coat. "Tell him we found his voice in the wires. That should jog his memory." As they left, the phone sat silent, the coiled cord resting like a serpent that had already bitten. The house was peaceful again, too peaceful, while somewhere down the hill, a small tape recorder waited in an evidence bag, ready to play the one thing Julian Parr had never intended anyone to hear, his own echo, caught in the art of forgetting. Chapter 17. A ghost in the recording. Faint background sound, a chiming clock, reveals the precise moment the alibi fell apart. The evening had settled softly over the city, the kind of calm that makes every light look warmer than it is. The Bellamy mansion stood against the dusk like an old memory, its windows reflecting the fading glow of day. Inside, the study was quiet again, the fire out, the air heavy with dust and faint perfume. Lieutenant Columbo sat by the desk with a small, reel-to-reel tape recorder in front of him. The machine looked almost delicate under his hands, a relic from another era. The magnetic tape gleamed faintly as it looped and turned, the soft hum filling the silence. Beside him, Sergeant Keller leaned against the doorway, coffee cup in hand, watching with patient curiosity. Columbo pressed the play button. Static whispered first, a soft, shivering sound like breathing in the dark. Then came the familiar voices, Julian Parr and Arthur Bellamy, talking about manuscripts, deadlines, friendship. Polite, controlled. And then, nothing. Silence, followed by the sharp crack of a gunshot. Keller flinched slightly. Columbo didn't. His eyes were half closed, his head tilted just enough to listen beyond what was obvious. "There it is," he murmured. "That's what I've been waiting for." Keller frowned. "The shot?" No, Columbo said softly. "Right before it. Listen close." He rewound the tape a few seconds, then played it again. The hum returned, the polite voices, and then faint and distant, so faint it was almost kind, came the sound of a clock chiming. 1, 2, 3. 11 slow notes. Columbo smiled to himself, tapping the air with his pencil. "That's the study clock, Mr. Bellamy's pride and joy. French mechanism, 100 years old. I heard it that first night. It chimed every hour, right on schedule." Keller blinked. "So what's odd about it?" Columbo leaned back in his chair, the cigar turning slowly between his fingers. "Well, according to Mr. Parr's statement, that phone call, the one on this tape, happened around 11:15. But the clock here stopped at 11:12, when the bullet hit the wall and jammed the works." He looked up, eyes soft but steady. "You see the problem?" Keller's eyes widened. "That means the call was recorded before the murder." "Exactly." Columbo's smile deepened. Not triumph, just quiet understanding. He made the recording earlier, planned the whole thing, played it back later to make it sound like Bellamy was alive. Only he didn't notice the clock. That's the trouble with perfectionists. They always overlook something human. He reached over, stopping the tape. The reels slowed to stillness, the room returning to its ordinary silence. "There's your ghost, Keller," he said softly. The clock that kept on chiming even after its time had run out. Outside, the first raindrops began to fall, brushing against the windows with gentle insistence. Columbo rose, stretching his back, and slipped the tape into an evidence bag. "You know," he said with a faint smile, "I don't believe in ghosts. But every so often something like this comes along, A sound, a shadow, a little thing that refuses to be forgotten. Keller nodded, the realization settling in. So that's what breaks the alibi. Columbo lit his cigar, the tip glowing like a small ember of certainty. "Yep," he said quietly. "The truth was ticking in the background all along. We just had to listen for it." He exhaled, the smoke curling lazily through the lamplight, mingling with the soft scent of rain. The house seemed to sigh in agreement, its secrets finally growing lighter, its lies coming undone. And as the recording's faint echo replayed in his mind, that steady, faithful chime marking the wrong hour, Columbo smiled to himself, thinking how even the smallest sounds can betray the biggest deceptions. Chapter 18. The final. Visit Columbo knocks one last time. Apologizing for the intrusion, the killer's smile fades as realization dawns. The afternoon light lay softly across the Bellamy estate, warm and forgiving. The rain had moved on, leaving behind the scent of damp earth and lilac drifting through the open windows. Somewhere in the garden a bird sang, a single hesitant note that hung in the air before fading into quiet. Inside, Julian Parr sat in the study with a cup of tea cooling beside him, his posture still impeccable, his calm practiced. He thought it was over. He'd told himself that often enough to believe it. The police had left. The press had lost interest. Even the widow had gone to the country for a few days of peace. The house, for the first time in weeks, was his again, silent, orderly, obedient. The storm had passed. Then came the knock. It was light, polite, and instantly recognizable. Julian froze, one hand hovering above the cup. For a moment he didn't move, hoping the sound had been imagination. But it came again, that familiar, apologetic rhythm. "Lieutenant Columbo," Julian said quietly, forcing a smile as he stood. Persistent to the end. He crossed the room, smoothed his hair, and opened the door. There he was, the same worn coat, the same tilted hat, the same mild eyes that never seemed to miss a thing. He looked almost embarrassed to be standing there. "Ah, Mr. Parr," Columbo said, smiling. "I hope I'm not bothering you. My wife says I've got a bad habit of showing up at the wrong time." "Not at all," Julian replied smoothly. "Though I admit I didn't expect another visit." "Oh, me neither, sir," Columbo said, stepping in slowly, turning his hat in his hands. "I was on my way home, thinking about this whole business. You ever get that feeling you've forgotten something? It's like an itch you can't reach." Julian gestured to a chair. "Please, Lieutenant, do sit down. Perhaps tea will help." "Oh, that's kind of you," Columbo said, easing himself into the chair with a sigh. "My wife says I drink too much coffee anyway. Tea's civilized." "You're a civilized man, Mr. Parr. Always calm, always precise. Must make life easier." Julian's smile didn't falter. "I find that discipline brings peace, Lieutenant." "Yeah," Columbo said softly, looking around the study. "Peace, that's a good word. You know, I've been thinking about that recording, the one from the night of the murder." He glanced up, eyes curious but gentle. "Funny thing about that clock chiming in the background. 11 strikes. That was smart, Mr. Parr, using the tape to make it sound like the call happened later." Julian's expression held steady, but his fingers tightened slightly on the teacup. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, I think you do, sir," Columbo said, voice still mild, almost apologetic. "It's just... the thing is, that clock stopped when the bullet hit it. 11:12 exactly, which means the tape was made before Mr. Bellamy died. He leaned forward, cigar rolling between his fingers. See, that's what was bothering me. How a man could be dead and still make a phone call. Turns out he didn't. You did. The silence that followed was almost kind, the sort of silence that gives a man a chance to breathe before the truth lands. Julian's lips parted, ready to form a reply, but no sound came. The practiced charm, the smooth diction, they all dissolved into stillness. Columbo stood slowly, buttoning his coat, his tone as gentle as if he were apologizing for stepping on someone's garden. You almost got away with it, Mr. Parr. I mean that. Smartest man I've met in years. But there's always something small, isn't there? One clock chime too many, one detail remembered too well. Julian tried to speak, but the words failed him. His reflection in the window showed a man older than he felt, a man whose calm had finally betrayed him. The faint smile he'd worn so easily trembled, then vanished altogether. Columbo reached for his hat, tipping it politely. I'll let the boys outside know. We won't be long. You might want to finish that tea, sir. It's going to get cold. He turned toward the door, his voice soft, almost kind. You know, my wife says I talk too much about my cases. But between us, this one I'll never forget. As the door closed behind him, the ticking of the broken clock seemed to echo in the room. Julian sat down slowly, staring at the cup, steam fading into the quiet. The air around him felt thinner somehow, lighter, as if the truth, finally spoken, had taken all the weight with it. Outside, Columbo's footsteps faded into the calm of the afternoon, and for the first time, the house was truly still. Chapter 19. That's what bothered me all along. Columbo reconstructs the crime, each word sinking like a nail into the coffin of denial. The afternoon light drifted lazily through the windows of the study, warm and forgiving, the kind of light that softens everything it touches. Dust floated gently in the air, golden motes turning slow circles, as though time itself were pausing to listen. Lieutenant Columbo stood near the fireplace, hat in hand, looking every bit the weary guest who had overstayed his welcome. Julian Parr sat opposite him, back straight, smile fixed in its usual place, calm, polite, perfectly rehearsed. He looked like a man waiting for a performance to end. But this was Columbo's stage now, and the final act had begun. I appreciate your patience, Mr. Parr, Columbo began, his tone gentle as ever. I know I've been a nuisance. My wife says I drive people crazy with all my questions. He smiled faintly, scratching behind his ear. But there's this one little thing that's been bothering me all along. Just wouldn't let me sleep. Julian gestured lightly, the picture of indulgence. Please, Lieutenant, by all means. I'd hate to deprive you of rest. Columbo chuckled softly, as though grateful for the permission. You see, it's about that night. I went over it 100 times. You were upstairs writing in your journal. Mr. Bellamy was down here, working at his desk. Then there's the gunshot, the call, the note, all neat and tidy. Almost too neat. Julian's smile didn't waver, but his eyes grew slightly distant. I told you everything I know. Oh, I know you did, sir. Every detail. You've got a memory like a steel trap. It's impressive. Columbo shifted his weight, fumbling in his coat pocket for a cigar. That's the funny thing, though. It's always the details that trip people up. See, I was thinking about that phone call you made. The one you said came through around 11:15. Julian nodded, cautious now. Yes? Well, here's the thing, Columbo said softly, lighting the cigar. That recording we found, it had the sound of Mr. Bellamy's clock chiming in the background. 11 strikes. Only that clock stopped at 11:12, right when the bullet hit it. So the call had to have been made before he died. Julian's posture stiffened, but his expression stayed smooth. That's absurd. Yeah, that's what I thought, too, Columbo said, smoke curling lazily between his words. Until I realized something else. The typewriter ribbon, it had 2 layers of ink. The first was your writing. You typed the note before the murder, didn't you? Then you rewound the ribbon, made it look like Bellamy did it himself. Julian opened his mouth to protest, but Columbo's quiet rhythm didn't leave space. You played the phone recording at 11:15, so the others would think he was still alive. You staged the alibi perfectly, except for one thing. He turned toward the desk, touching the brass clip on the manuscript. You straightened this after the police left. Couldn't help your self-order, right? But when you did, you left a fingerprint over Bellamy's blood. Just one. That's what's been bothering me all along. The silence that followed was almost tender. The ticking of the wall clock seemed louder now, each second marking the slow collapse of composure. Columbo sighed, his tone soft, almost regretful. You're a brilliant man, Mr. Parr. You thought of everything. But the truth always hides in the smallest smudge, the faintest sound. You can plan a perfect lie, but you can't control the clock. Julian's voice broke its calm at last. You can't prove. Oh, I don't have to, Columbo interrupted gently, slipping his notebook closed. The tape, the clock, the ribbon, they'll do the talking. I just listen. He placed his hat on his head, tipping it with quiet courtesy. That's all that bothered me, sir. I just had to hear it out loud. As Columbo walked toward the door, the detective's silhouette soft against the sunlight, leaving Julian in the stillness of his unraveling. The faint smell of cigar smoke lingered like punctuation dot outside. The garden shimmered with peace. Inside, the lie finally stopped breathing. Chapter 20. When the room fell silent as Columbo leaves the room. The murderer's smile returns, this time hollow, broken, and utterly defeated. The study was quiet again, though not in the same way it had been before. It was the kind of quiet that follows a storm, fragile, trembling, and almost too perfect. Dust motes floated lazily in the golden slant of afternoon light, the scent of cigar smoke still lingering faintly in the air. The echo of Columbo's voice seemed to hang there too, soft but immovable, like a bell that had stopped ringing only a moment ago. Julian Parr stood perfectly still by the fireplace. His reflection shimmered faintly in the mirror above the mantel. A man of immaculate posture, tailored perfection, and a smile that had once held the world at arm's length. But now the smile had thinned. It trembled on his lips like something that no longer fit. The door had closed gently behind the lieutenant. The sound final, but not cruel. Even in departure, Columbo had carried the same calm that made him so dangerous, all courtesy. No malice, as though he were leaving behind not a criminal, but a man who had finally told the truth to himself. Julian's gaze drifted to the desk. The typewriter sat there, quiet and accusing. The manuscript, The perfect alibi lay exactly where Columbo had left it, one corner folded, a faint fingerprint glimmering in the light. He could almost hear the detective's voice, slow, thoughtful, apologetic. "You're a brilliant man, Mr. Parr, but brilliance doesn't erase time. It just delays it." Julian exhaled slowly, his breath uneven. The silence in the room deepened, as though the house itself had stopped listening to him. The clock on the wall ticked once, a lonely, fragile sound, and then fell still, as if ashamed to keep time any longer. He crossed the room to the window. Outside, the garden glowed under a soft sunset, every leaf and petal washed clean by rain. The same path where Columbo had once stood in the downpour was now dry, the footprints long since erased. The detective was gone, but his presence remained, invisible, patient, eternal. Julian lifted a hand and touched the glass. It was cool beneath his fingertips. The smile returned then, faint and ghostly. It was not the smile of triumph that had once followed Columbo's exit. It was the hollow echo of it, an imitation of confidence that no longer believed itself. The truth had finally reached him, quiet and complete. There would be no escape, no clever revision, no perfect alibi left to write. For the first time, Julian realized how heavy silence could be. The house seemed to breathe around him. One slow, sorrowful exhale, as if it, too, were relieved that the story had finally ended. He turned back toward the desk, the smile fading altogether. The faint ring of brandy still marked the wood, the ghost of a night long gone. Julian sat, resting his hands on the keys of the typewriter. For a moment he almost began to write, but the words, once so ready to obey, refused to come. All that remained was the echo of Columbo's footsteps retreating down the hall, and the memory of a man who had outsmarted everyone except himself. Outside, a soft breeze stirred the curtains, whispering through the quiet. Somewhere in the distance a car door closed, followed by the low, steady hum of an engine fading into the horizon. When the sound was gone, the room fell silent, utterly, finally silent, and the murderer's faint, broken smile vanished with the light. And the story ended.